Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my lecture into Metropolitan conflict, and this is section 1.2 of my notes. That's page 4 of the notes. As you know, you can access the notes by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Just download the PDF, use it to supplement your reading and your existing knowledge. The notes are from Metropolitan Government and Governance, Theoretical Perspectives, Empirical Analyses, and the Future. So this is section 1.2, page 4, and with that, let's begin. And this is section 1.2. Okay, so in the last section we discussed the various forms of governance. We talked about the sort of unitary model. We talked about a federative approach. We talked about the polycentric model. We talked a lot about how, in terms of governance, and the formation of government and the way in which it's executed in terms of governance, that it used to be the case, sort of the traditional approach was that a very centralized government, heavy centralization facilitated the execution of policy and governance more effectively, right? And we talked about the difference between merger of municipalities and the fact that in terms of centralization, the benefit that was gained was that execution of policy was facilitated by one stabilized form. The power, however, and the imbalances in power that are likely in that mode are problematic, and thus we talked about any number of approaches, the last being a more polycentric approach. In terms of local municipalities, what we realized was this polycentric approach was beneficial insofar as it led to what's known as voting with your feet. What does that mean? It means that individual constituents within any metropolitan area are going to, this is a sort of a correlation, are likely to leave one metropolitan area for another if they see their migration as yielding economic advantage, better educational opportunities, security and safety and such. So that there's a competition, right, and almost a capitalistic application or a capitalistic interpretation, more appropriately, to the polycentric model. The way in which you could assess the polycentric model is exactly the same way you would assess any sort of capitalistic structure. Competition is good. So where state municipalities or local municipalities are competing with themselves, we reap that is, government reaps the advantages of increased constituency, increased membership in that particular locality, and those who lost constituents as a process of their migration, as a process of them voting with their feet, now need to transform the way in which they execute governance, right? So that government and governmental regulation benefits with the, this is the assumption, of course, right? Benefits with the increased population, which yields increased revenue, increased blah, 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 increased representation potentially within the locality, and they are destabilized and weakened when people leave their locality for another. So that's sort of the quick tidy from the last section. In this section 1.2, we're going to continue with self-government. So let's talk about 4 assumptions concerning the principle of self-government. So the 4 assumptions. This is a key point. These assumptions, this is a quote, assumptions about the importance and character of human behavior is what's at stake, right? At stake is the recognition that we are perpetually seeking to accommodate the way in which we structure our government, and the way in which we execute policy in terms of governance based on human behavior. So human behavior is going to be central. What are the people doing in this region? What do they want? How do they shop? How do they buy? What are their relationships? How do they use the infrastructure? Are they using the infrastructure and such? The idea is, insofar as we not regulate, but insofar as we observe, and insofar as we're making attempts to understand human behavior, we have the responsibility, that is, government has a responsibility to adapt to changes in that behavior. So we're going to have to first begin with an understanding, a very general understanding of human behavior, recognize that human behavior individually isn't going to yield enough knowledge for us to be able to talk about government or NINTS, and thus we must begin to at least conceptualize the prospect of collective human behavior. And this is nothing new now. I mean, Google and analytics and any number of technology firms that have sprung up in the last 5 years tote a lot of their fame and a lot of their business model on the ability to make predictive models based on human behavior, both individually and collectively. And there should be no surprise to the relationship between human behavior and governance and mint. So one key characteristic, super general, super introductory, the ghetto philosophy version we just began, is the fact that the overwhelming majority of the U.S. population works 9 to 5. So 9 to 5 is the standard. In terms of 9 to 5, you would imagine that since you have to be work at 9, traffic congestion is probably at its highest between the hours. You don't even have to be part of any transportation firm to know this. You can just intuit this as almost fact. I would imagine that transportation traffic is at its highest congestion between the hours of maybe 7 and 9, maybe 6 too, but maybe 7 and 9. That is the hours right before work and the hours right after work, between 5 and 7. So if you're going to talk about how we manage congestion, how we manage traffic, the best times to do constructions to the roads and such, obviously, since behavior, the recognition of collective behavior in terms of traffic use and the use of transportation infrastructure, it wouldn't make sense to build, it wouldn't make sense to do it wouldn't make sense to do, any repairs to the roadway during these times, right? It's sort of obvious, right? You wouldn't want to do repairs to a roadway at 5 o'clock. Why? Because people get off work and they're going to be using the roads at 5 o'clock, right? Just like a 3-year-old can figure that out. There's no depth to that. What's the importance with respect to human behavior? We came about this realization that that's a bad time to do road work because we recognize that people use the roads collectively. Based on their behavior, they use the roads most during these hours. Simple, right? So you can immediately have a general context with which we can articulate sort of this more abstract discussion of human behavior. I have to sort of follow my notes well, because up until now, the discussion has been sort of very pragmatic, which is what it should be. I'm not trained as a political scientist. I'm not trained as a sort of a policy. I didn't do anything in sort of policy-based analysis. I'm trained as a theorist, as a philosopher. So I always bring a very sort of abstract theoretical approach to my analysis. I always also apply it. But this lecture series hasn't given me the ability to do a lot of theory. There is a ton of theory behind human behavior, but I'm going to follow my notes and see where, because it's been a while since I wrote these notes, see where my notes take me, and I'll gauge the level of theoretical complexity that I add. So number 1, bottom of page 4, individual behavior should constitute the basic unit of an, oh no, I missed after page 107. Human behavior itself assumes the universality, generalizability of human behavior. A potential problem with this is that we can talk about collective communities, we can talk about collective behavior, we can group many of the constituents into macro level groupings, but they're always going to be outliers. So a potential problem with any attempt to talk about collective mass behavior is that we always have to make an account for outliers. There's always going to be outliers. And while our analyses should be designed to cover the majority, we do need to keep note of anomalous and outliers, anomalous behavior and outliers specifically. Okay, so now number 1. individual behavior should constitute the basic unit of analysis. This is a direct quote from the article, or from the book rather, and this I'm assuming is on 107. I didn't put the page number there, so forgive me, but I'm assuming it's around the same page that I got the rest of the information. It might be 43 though, because this is 43. It's a shame. I always put page numbers and I forgot to put the page number, so forgive me for that. But the quote is, individual behavior should, emphasis, anytime you see the word should, it's an ethical claim. So we're talking about something in the future, right? We're prescribing some behavior. It should be the case that human behavior serves as the basic unit of analysis. So what are the benefits of this, right? What are the benefits of this assumption? So the first assumption is that we need to, in talking about the governance of a particular locality, we should look at human behavior as the unit for which we make a lot of our assessments. So the benefit is the regulation of metropolitan communities is inherently a regulation of people. It's not PC to talk about regulating people's lives because it seems almost totalitarian, right? So I don't mean regulation in you have to do this, you must do this, be here or else. It is, I think a better way of we might be able to articulate is accommodation, right? It is an attempt in terms of municipalities. Governance should be an attempt to accommodate the constituency. You want to implement those policies, you want to implement those programs that facilitate sort of this general sense of accommodation, right? If I recognize that roads are being used at this time, maybe I want to start my construction at, midnight, when no one or very few people are using it, and do my construction projects between the hours of 12 and 3 a.m., right? I'm accommodating my constituency, and that accommodation is an attempt to exist within the knowledge of their collective behavior. I have to function within the knowledge of their collective behavior. Where there are competing goals, and I'll give you a good example, where there are competing goals between the goals of the state and the goals of the constituency with respect to behavior, that's where you have problems. And what do I mean by that? So, very sort of obvious example, it might be important that in terms of generating state revenue, that we go from, in the state of Florida, we have a lot of sort of toll booths that you have to pay. So in terms of the toll booths, before, it was the case that if you didn't have, we have this thing called a sun pass, and basically it's like a magnetic thing that you stick to your window. It must transmit something to the overpass, and it says, hey, bill my credit card X number of dollars. And it used to be the case that they had maybe 1 or 2 lanes devoted for that in the past, for years, for almost a decade. You might have 1 or 2 lanes devoted for that. The rest of the lanes, you went to a traditional toll booth. As a matter of fact, I worked at the toll booth, so I know this. You went to my lane, where I was wearing a horrendous shirt, and while the water was splashing in my face, because you refused to turn off your windshield wipers, I was, it wasn't that bad, but it was on my shirt a couple of times. I take tolling, you sort of physically handle change with the customer and give them directions and such. Okay. Obviously, there's a lot of overhead for that. So what the state wants to do, an interest of the state, is to both expedite traffic, but also a second goal, a second objective, would be to minimize its overhead, because you have to pay the employees. So changing the system facilitates 2 ends for the state. It expedites traffic because you're not stopping, and it minimizes the amount of sort of overhead in terms of paying employees. But you have to not retrofit, but you have to sort of change, the structure of this toll booth in order to accommodate those ends. Now, the process of going into this new system, and it was told to us, inconvenienced a lot of the citizenry. The citizens were upset initially. They're like, oh, well, I don't want to get SunPass. And then it was, well, if you don't get SunPass, we're going to use our cameras to send you the bill based on your license plate, so might as well just use the SunPass and make everybody. So of course people don't, they resist, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. And they give us, you give you a year warning, hey, don't forget, we're about to change, we're letting you know we're going to change, we're changing, if you don't change, you're going to be fine, we told you a year now, we've changed, you still haven't changed, you have 1 month after the change, now we're going to start finding you, right? The idea is that it is undeniable that there is an attempt to regulate the behavior of the constituents in the area. Why? Because there are advantages both for the constituents and the state, but you can see where there might be an attempt to butt heads here. You're going to always have those members, and I'm not in policy, I'm not in political science, so this is the first example that came into my head, but I understand the theory of it all. And it's just obvious, human nature. There's statistically always going to be the outliers, who refuse to accommodate to some change in their environment. The idea is not me because I'm a citizen as well, but I always assume the role of whatever it is I'm discussing. So those in government who implement policies for governance have to recognize that insofar as this new policy is being implemented, there's undeniably going to be those who refuse to conform in some way. But that tension in that refusal, if you know that at the time of writing policy, if you know that before you implement it, which you should, before you implement it, you can allow for exactly what I was just saying, accommodations, right? So you're going to have maybe elders with older folks in the community who might not really get the word as quickly as the younger people. And maybe what we'll do is we'll have a little grace period after it's been implemented as law, and maybe a month after, there'll be some leniency that will show. But after that, and you get the idea, right? So that the idea is, yes, we're definitely talking about the regulation of individual people, but it's not this sort of ominous regulation of bodies, like sit here, do that. I just gave you an example in which people's lives and daily practices are being systematically regulated, but it isn't this sort of boogeyman affair, right? So I think that that lends sort of credence to the position, right? So the one advantage is the regulation of the metropolitan community is inherently a regulation of people, of constituents, but insofar as we're talking about the regulation of people, constituents, as I said before, it should always be done with the auspice of accommodate, or under the auspice of accommodating. Those things that would create too much havoc, that would facilitate a disadvantage to the constituents, you want to try and in terms of governance, regulate the way in which we implement it so that it doesn't inconvenience. The example again, make construction changes to the road during hours where it's not really being used, right? So you get the idea. Nothing revolutionary there, I hope, right? So, 1-1. So the justification, this comes from Gulick, who writes, we are not dealing with a city at all. We are dealing with people, which involve kaleidoscopic patterns, and that's important, kaleidoscopic patterns of movement for people and ideas and goods in production. And this movement isn't a metaphorical movement. This movement is real movement, physical movement of people, goods, infrastructure, people, goods, and ideas. The people and goods obviously on our infrastructure, the ideas through the social milieu, right? The idea is we need to recognize that when we talk about a city, to talk about a city is almost exactly the same, it's used in the exact same sense as our discussion on society. Neither the city nor society exists as an empirical phenomenon. It isn't an objective thing in the world. It's not something, neither the city nor society is something that can be quantified and touched. The city and society both are concepts that we use to make sense of a myriad, right? I don't need the article, but any myriad number of social relations, right? Including economic relations. So the city is in part the infrastructure. The city is in part the people and their use of the infrastructure. The city is the way in which we seek to accommodate and regulate the people on the infrastructure. It's the economic engine that propagates and propels and continues the citizens' use of the infrastructure and such, and on and on and on. So that the city is, in its most simple sort of articulation, it is the interrelation of individuals, the infrastructure, and the economics that afford and allow for that use. That conceptualization isn't something that is readily tangible. And what Gulick is saying, it's, at the end of the day, we're talking about people. We're talking about really human beings, right? And in terms of metropolitan conflict, I'm contextualizing this primarily, not exclusively, within the United States of America. In the United States of America, it is always already a moral business, right? Politics, whether you want to believe this or not, whether you want to acknowledge this or not, politics is a moral business. It ought to be more so a moral business, because we are talking about the regulation of human lives. We are talking about writing and passing policy and legislation that directly affect human life. So there needs to be a strong, and I don't know, I have to be careful when I say morality, because it evokes religion. And so I don't mean morality in terms of religious morality. I mean morality in terms of prescriptions, in its most sort of secularized sense, right? Morality in terms of prescriptions made about how things ought to be, or how things should be, or if it's strong enough, how things must be. But I don't mean morality in terms of, a deity X said this and a deity Y said that. I definitely don't mean that. I think the mistake that people make, especially in the United States, since we have a very clear and clearly defended separation of church and state in the U.S., is that, oh, well, politics isn't about morals. Which is probably why so many people, of us layfolk, look at our politicians and our representatives with disdain is a strong word, but it's the only word that comes to mind, with disdain or maybe distrust, because we believe that they don't recognize the moral obligation that they have, right? Politics is inherently a moral business. I believe that. It is. It's not a matter of my belief. Politics is inherently a moral business because it prescribes collective behavior. While that appeal doesn't need to be religious, those in political power need to recognize that they are morally obligated to the people, right? So that these decisions have to be made to accommodate, to address the needs of, and of the population. And we immediately have a means of holding our political leaders accountable, and I talked about accountability in the last two sections, insofar as the decisions they make disenfranchise to an extreme extent, inconvenience to a lesser extent, or undermine the interests or cripple or directly affect their population. We can hold, and we should hold, our elected officials accountable when they're not acting morally, right? When they're not acting with the prescriptive interests of the people in mind. So 1B, one of the disadvantages to this then would be this particular assumption pertains to the unit of analysis itself. That is, the unit of analysis being based in human behavior, which is behavior. But if that behavior is externally conditioned, one is not studying the individual, but those external factors influencing the individual's actions. This is sort of deep, so I'll explain it. So the example is Black Friday is a perfect example. So the idea is that we want to recognize that in terms of discussing relationships, the way in which those in government expedite the interests of its constituents via policy and governance, right? You want to get this as quickly as possible. If people need things, right? If you can imagine there's a hurricane, you want FEMA in place as quickly as possible. If there are needs of the people, you want these needs to be addressed. But it's not just that you want these needs addressed, you want these needs addressed expeditiously. The idea is we make the assumption, this is the con, that the basis of our deliberation is that of human behavior. What if it's the case that the behavior that we're watching isn't organically derived, but it is externally conditioned? If it's externally conditioned, then the behavior that we're assessing, that we're observing, that we're seeking to understand, doesn't tell us more about the individual inclination, it tells us more about some other structure of influence. So Black Friday is a perfect example. You look at Black Friday, you would recognize that you might imagine that you're a local, let's say you're a local chief of police. Probably doesn't need to be that high up on the food chain, but just imagine that you're the local chief of police. You know it's Black Friday tomorrow, or at the end of the week. I would imagine the local chief of police, again, not having read this, just intuitively, would say, hey, it's Black Friday, there's probably going to be some stores that will be packed. You pick your favorite store that we think is going to be packed. And there might be inclinations to shoplift because obviously there are more people, so it's probably likely that shoplifting is a little bit higher on a day like Black Friday. People are going to be outside waiting. They're going to be a little agitated because it's too hot or too cold, and they're being outside waiting. I mean, in the state of Florida, November it can be really hot. Everywhere else it might be cool. So, you know, tensions might be a little bit high. I'm going to offer my police officers an opportunity to have a little overtime if you work Black Friday because I'm anticipating. I'm making the prescription that this social practice is going to necessitate more police representation so that we can govern the metropolitan area that much more effectively. It makes complete sense. There's nothing wrong with that. Is there anything? This is absolutely right. But the idea is don't assume that the need for more police is a consequence of some organically derived condition in the people themselves. Their behavior has been conditioned. Why? Because nationally, stores have agreed that the rock bottom prices for the year will be on this particular day between this particular times, and as a consequence of that, the collective behavior has been conditioned. So that you can, this is much deeper now, so that what we need to do, and I'm presenting this for people who are potentially completing PhDs and such, right? So this wouldn't really make sense for John and Jane Doe on a regular discussion. This is more analytical, and you can use this to facilitate broader meaning in your own research. But what we need to recognize is that we have external factors influencing collective behavior. Once we recognize that there are, in fact, external factors influencing collective behavior, then those external factors are indirectly going to influence our mode of governance. Right? That point is a lot deeper, but it should make sense now. The police chief's decision to offer overtime to his or her staff is a consequence, indirect consequence of the stores offering rock bottom prices on that day. External factors influencing collective behavior, that collective behavior warranting more sort of police representation to keep everything in order, keep governance in place, keep aggressions down, thus the indirect relationship. I offer that as an example, not because it's a profound example, but to legitimize the relationship between indirect behavioral influence and the need for a corresponding transformation in governance. That's a lot more sort of complex. And since you recognize that relationship, I give that to you as a means of, now you have a new mode of looking at any number of relationships. Well, how is it that these external influences could transform needs locally and think about any number of new relationships? The point is to give you an example, demonstrate how the example works, and then you use that example in your knowledge of policy and your knowledge of relationships and political blah blah blah, and do something new, right? Do something new based on the example that I gave you. All right. Again, I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not in policy proper. I'm a theorist, so I just wanted to expose you to the justification for that argument. You take that, now that you know that it's legitimate, and apply it to something more profound. So number 2, individuals are primarily motivated by rationality and self-interest. Right? So this is important, right? This is a direct quote, for which I forgot the page number yet again. Again, forgive me. So individuals are primarily motivated by rationality and self-interest. That is a good point. And if we're talking, remember the context of this section is on, I forget the name of it, public choice model, right? The public's ability to choose. So one aspect of public choice is the idea of using human behavior as our basic unit. The second aspect of the public choice model isn't about human behavior, but the idea that humans act rationally. And the pro is, I don't know what this means, so I'll ask for feedback. Individuals are, I know what it means, I'm being a bit facetious here. Individuals are primarily motivated by rationality and self-interest. So I guess the author is saying, in terms of public choice model, that if we were to make assessments of human beings and how they deliberate, overwhelmingly people exercise the use of reason in making their deliberations. Okay. I don't know. Well, maybe that is true. Is that really what's being said? Because if that's really what's being said, then I think this might be an instance where the theory doesn't really conform to the facts. Because I look at human behavior, and this is what I do as a social scientist. I watch human behavior, and I watch how people act, and I watch how people deliberate, and I watch how people think about complex issues, and more often than not, I personally have witnessed and seen an absolute abject failure to exercise reason in the deliberative process, right? I think far too frequently we don't use reason. Now, if my assessment of public choice model, specifically with respect to this assumption of rational deliberation, is inappropriate, tell me how I got it wrong. Because to me, it sounds like exactly as it says, right? Individuals are primarily motivated by rationality and self-interest. And I get the self-interest part. I would absolutely agree that people are primarily motivated by self-interest. But I don't see how self-interest necessitates rationality. I think self-interest, more often than not, necessitates irrationality, right? This is probably the basis of all of our global conflict, is that it doesn't make sense. The very attempt to try and make sense of it undermines the position. But I might be overthinking it. I don't know that I agree in the public choice model. I definitely agree with using human behavior as a basic constituent, a basic referent. I agree with that. Number two, I agree that on whole, individuals are collectively interested, at least in the West, are interested by self-interest. I'll grant that with the caveat of it being in the West. I don't agree with that on the East. But I don't know that I understand what it means to say that part of that motivation is always rational or an appeal to rationality. I think that might be a bit dated now, but you get the idea, right? The idea is we, in assessing human behavior, recognize that one way in which we can make sense of what we're seeing is to contextualize the observation as, or within the context itself, right? Is to identify the observation within the context of. It's probably even better to say is to interpret the meaning of the observation within the context of both rationality and self-interest. I'm willing to acknowledge the latter. The former needs a little more clarification as to what that might mean, but it's important to understand that rationality and self-interest are important in the public choice model nevertheless. Okay, number three, individuals adopt maximizing strategies to realize their private and public goals. And this idea of maximizing strategies is, as I have here, articulated well in a Hobbesian sense. So one of the benefits is a Hobbesian benefit, coordinated actions in conjunction with others. Right? A maximizing strategy might be an attempt to coordinate my actions with others such that I preserve the things that I have, the likelihood of me losing what I have is lessened or nullified, and I increase the likelihood that I'll get more. So there is definitely within rational choice theory, properly, and within an individual's ability to use reason, an immediate recognition that in terms of our social behavior, and I don't want to go too deep into this because it's a whole different lecture, but in terms of our social behavior, where we have aversion, right? We have aversion to losing the things that we've already gained. So the things that I already have in my possession, I'm averse to losing it. But if I could get more, and there's some sense that, oh no, you could get a lot more if you take a little bit of a gamble, I'm willing to take the gamble to get more. So the idea is, in terms of this this maximizing strategy, is that it benefits us, right? I don't want to put this in terms of risk aversion, though I could. It's too deep for this series here. But in terms of Metropolitan, understanding the Metropolitan relationship and governance, various modes of governance within the Metropolitan community, what you need to recognize is from a very macro level, this is a very sort of abstract level, but a legitimate level, is that individuals will tend to maximize their individual benefit by applying various strategies to that. And what is one strategy? One strategy is their strength in numbers. So that people will open up businesses together. They'll partner with one another. If you create a condition in which individuals are incentivized to work with others, then you transform, you regulate collective. Do I want to go this deep? I don't know if I want to go this deep. But I'll put this much out there. If you want to regulate, change the way in which people interact, and I won't go any deeper than this, just because it's not appropriate for this lecture. Because this is more sort of strategic, I don't want to go too deep into the theory. If you want to transform the nature of collective behavior, what you need to do is implement an incentive to transform the nature of behavior. Otherwise, you just say, listen, on such and such a date, new policies in place. If you don't follow, then you're penalized. Okay, that's one mode. A less direct mode is to offer an incentive to change the behavior. One thing that I've seen recently, this isn't quite the point, but I think this shows what's happening. I've seen a commercial. I probably should have linked it. In New York, they said, hey, do you want to come to New York? Do you want to set up business in this particular region of New York, and you'll have tax-free business benefits for like 5 years or 10 years. What is I think it's absolutely freaking genius. I think it's genius. Too bad I don't have anything to sell because I would be leaving and going to New York. What's the impetus behind this initiative? And maybe I'll find the commercial if I can remember. I probably won't, and link it here. It's a cool commercial, and I'm sure if you live in the States, you've probably seen it. Well, it might be a regional commercial too. The idea is people had made the decision that the economic viability of this particular location in New York was languishing. But the infrastructure was obviously there to support some new economy. So I can guarantee that despite the fact that I'm not on the board of any of the people who made the decision to do this or shoot the commercial, you better know, just from that little bit of information, that the economic condition of that particular area in New York is probably languishing, is probably not doing so well. But there's great infrastructure to support growth, because you don't expect people to come and build from scratch. So there's probably lots of vacant infrastructure, access to major highways and subways and blah, 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 airports and such. It's probably perfectly located, but nothing's happening. Now imagine that I'm a business person in the South who's done pretty good business for myself in the South, and I want to go north and establish my business brand north, so that I have both southern and northern representation. Why in the world would I go somewhere else other than to that location in New York, when I know it serves the economic investment, it serves my own economic interest to do business there, because I get a tax break for 10 years. So you better believe I'm looking to that location, right? I'm looking to that location. I might have been looking somewhere further south from New York, but the idea is now my behavior has changed. At least I'm thinking about it. No, you know what? I was thinking about going to Carolina first. I was thinking about going to VA first. I was thinking about going to Maryland. I'm actually going to go to New York. Why? Because Uncle Sam says he'll cut me a break for 10 years if I go to New York. Of course, what ends up happening? After 10 years, if I'm still in business, my business is booming. Great. Uncle Sam gets tax revenue. Great. I establish my brand both in the North and South. Great. Everybody wins. the idea is the regulation of human behavior is itself a consequence of maximizing strategy. And the maximizing strategy can both be facilitated by the individual and government, and it's when the two come together that you get the best, right? You get an advantage that benefits the government, you get the advantage that benefits the business owner, and I would imagine the consumer as well on the back end, right? So this is one idea, sort of the coordinated action. And that coordinated action is a contemporary coordination that I saw that I think is genius, right? I hope it doesn't, even if it takes a while for it to start, if it's slow to start, it should be in place for a few years, just to allow people the opportunity to understand what it is, and to go see the site. I would imagine you send prospects out, and CEOs send their field reps out to take a survey of the area and really get an idea of what's at stake. But at the end of the day, and I'm not speaking on behalf of municipalities, obviously, so I don't know that you don't have to pay taxes for 10 years. But I remember it was something along those lines, right? It was like, come here, do business with us, and you get a tax break for 10 years. That's a huge incentive. That incentive is going to facilitate the coordination of, hopefully, collective behavior, right? That's the idea. In a Nietzschean sense, the benefit of these maximizing strategies is education, power, strength, beauty, of course, I forgot, money, right? In this example, the benefit is money. More money in the pocket of the business owner to get established. You're not overburdened by cost in your first 10 years. If you're still around in 10 years, well, guess what ends up happening? You've proven yourself, and you've created a new market for your company. Coupled with what you already have, it's just good business practice. It's great business practice. So what are some of the cons of these adopting maximizing strategies? Con, only a problem depending on your point of view. When the goal seeks to harm, disrupt the collective good, or is directed toward usurpation of existing political power. I couldn't really think of an example in which a maximizing strategy, because maximizing is already it's already beneficial. It's always already a beneficial approach. I couldn't think of an example in which it was bad. So let me just read the disclaimer. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that the attempt to usurp political power is inherently problematic. It's problematic for existing power and creates a condition for exclusion. Okay, blah, 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 nothing revolutionary there. I should come up with an example, though. Talk about individuals adopt maximizing strategy to realize their private and public goals. It can't be bad. I can't think, only when your goal is, I mean, I could be mistaken. I'm certainly open to being critiqued on this point. But if, assuming that your private and public goals are in line with sort of the adherence to law, I can't really think of an example where it would be bad. The only thing that's coming to my mind right now is something seedy, like maybe a strip club or, that kind of thing. I can see where there might be legal basis for expansion in that regard, but it might have some social implications. I can't really think of an example where, in terms of a public choice model, where the individual citizenry is seeking to maximize its own benefits, and it ends up being counterproductive unless the actual intent is itself malicious. If the intent is itself malicious, so we're talking about mafia, well, obviously I'm maximizing my own benefit, but I'm creating a scam. That's obviously doesn't apply, right? That's obviously bad. So if the intent is to make money, if the intent is to do business, if the intent is to expand and to grow, and it's legal, it's hard for me to see, outside of examples of the more seedy aspects of the business community, how it would be a problem. Obviously, if we're talking about strip clubs and stuff like that, like gentlemen's clubs and all that, I can see, especially in the state of New York, I used to live in New York for a while when I was a child, and at the time I didn't know what it was, but I would see XXS and XXX all over the place and like neon pink everywhere. And it wasn't until I got older that I recognized, like, oh my goodness, there's, you go into the city, that's all that there was. Of course, that was cleaned up, because of the attempt to get sort of mutual benefit. There was pressure on the political establishment at the time. I want to say that Giuliani is responsible for this, but I'm not sure. But there was pressure on the political establishment at the time to clean up because tourists didn't want to see it. It potentially was generating, some surplus tax dollars, but it probably was less than the tax dollars that could have been generated provided that they made a change, they had the facelift, and thus there was an attempt to transform this business practice because the constituency wanted to see it change. And seeing it change ended up making good economic sense, and thus it did. And then lastly, number 4, the level of information that an individual has pertaining to decisions vary considerably from complete certainty to uncertainty. Right? So we have a recognition that we're going to begin our analysis in terms of public choice, my choice, to do any number of things, to elect candidates, to open up business. Usually I think public choice goes hand in hand with both political and economic interests. It goes well. Public choice model is well suited. I approach public choice theory and public choice model from a philosophical standpoint, which I'm not going to get into here because it's not appropriate. But in terms of the analysis of human behavior, yeah, okay, so we're going to ground public choice in the recognition that human behavior is important, both in economic circles, which is obviously the case. People want to track everything that you buy so that they can sell you stuff that they know you like to buy. And obviously, human behavior is important in terms of political governance, because governance takes into account how we behave, what we do, how we buy, how we travel, how we use the infrastructure, and they make changes and accommodations based on that fact. That fact, however, is built on the assumption that the constituency is both rational and self-interested. I agree that the constituency in the West is self-interested. I won't agree with that in the East. So I don't believe that this is a universal or generalizable. Just use that word. Or generalizable, specifically because it's so individualistic. It's so Western. This emphasis on subjectivity and subjective identity. But you recognize if we're talking about human behavior, then we're going to contextualize our analysis of human behavior by referencing both the rationality of the subject, their ability to make rational deliberations which affect their behavior, and the interest of the subject. I need this for myself, which then affects behavior as well. That recognition of the individual is going to apply to collective individuals via these maximizing strategies, right? People are going to, and they're going to have the intent on working together in various social relationships, various economic relationships, various political relationships to benefit others, but also benefit themselves and protect the stuff that they have. This is where, I'm not going to discuss it here because it's not appropriate, but this is where you could incorporate discussions on risk aversion, right? It's number 3, where you can maximizing strategies, where you can talk about risk aversion and such, but I'm not going to get into that here. And thus, lastly, the decision making is going to be contingent on accessibility to information. Obviously, the more information you have access to, the better informed your decision. The less information you have access to, the less well informed your decision. The individual constituent in his or her life needs to recognize that the decision that he or she is making is contingent on information. And the question is always, what is the source of that information? What is the source of that information? I wish I could do a hybridization of both my lectures. I can't, and I have a gem of a gem in my head right now, but I talked about the idea of discursive structures and such in another lecture, but I just recognized the link between the two concepts, which I can't even get into it because it doesn't apply here. But let me see if I could tie it in. Oh my goodness, that's so good, actually. It's freaking genius. Yes, I can tie this in. It's important in making, so let's use the public choice model in terms of electing representatives. So you got a Democratic representative, you got a Republican representative, and you're going to make a decision for who you want to represent your district or your state or whatever. In terms of number 4, I can actually use it. This is genius. I'm going to have to develop this on the side note. Your attempt to make the decision for who's the better representative ought not to be, morally, right? Secular moralism, but ought not to be contingent on just commercials. Because obviously, whoever has the most money is going to have the most commercials, and they're going to slander the other guy. Don't think Democrats don't slander. Don't think Republicans don't slander. They both slander. Democrats and Republicans both slander, especially when it's coming to election time. So one person mudslings against the other mudslings against the other, but imagine that one party has 2 or 3 times the amount of money. That means you're going to have 2 or 3 times the amount of exposure to the message that this other person is bad. And all of them validate by appealing to some authority, and all of them validate their claims by appealing to something. If you are going to make your decision and thus govern yourself via practice, go out to the booth and vote for Party X versus Party Y, based on only having exposure to commercials, then your act, your observable act of deciding, choosing a representative, assuming that you're not partisan, right? Assuming that you're independent, right? Or you're willing to be swayed by reason, which is the second criteria, that you're willing to be swayed by reason, then your act is indirectly influenced by money. Capital is really making the decision for you, right? Which I think is super awesome, because you think about the role of super PACs and capital investment and all that other stuff. A couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I couldn't have answered that question. I didn't have enough exposure to research. Now I can answer it relatively easy. The amount of money that is had indirectly influences your ability to vote if you're not thinking deliberatively, right? Assuming that you're also not partisan, right? If you're not thinking deliberatively and it's just exposure to sort of commercials and what people are saying, and you're not fact-checking yourself, then you're going to vote because of exposure, and that exposure is contingent on money and financial investment. Thus, you're going to vote because an individual has more money to invest, period. And unfortunately, it's the case that a whole lot of people vote that way. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't really care, to be honest with you. Me, I vote based on I vote based on who I think has the best, most sound position. I'll vote for any candidate. I don't really care, as long as the candidate has, you know, a good platform. But a lot of people don't vote like that. So I think there is a way to incorporate other. There's so much that you can build into this. Unfortunately, this lecture series would be 50 hours if I fleshed it all out. But I'm always reading, and what I would encourage you, quick side note before I move on, especially if you're a graduate student, read a lot of stuff. Like if you're doing policy stuff, don't just read policy stuff. Read race stuff while you're reading your policy stuff. Read, you know, feminist stuff. Read a little bit of everything, because you will be afforded an ability to see the world in ways that others could never see the world, because you have so much exposure to different theories, to different concepts, to different modes of justification, such that I can take this analysis and apply it to risk aversion, or apply it to non-discursive power structures, or apply it to ethnic and race relations, because I've read a lot of this. What I want you to do is recognize that we can make sense of a lot of these. We can make sense of a lot of these theories, especially something like the public choice model, by making appeals to any other number of social structures and social paradigms. So what's the pro? It is undeniable that all decision-making strategies emphasize information acquisition. You got to learn. What's the con? The assumption from number one is that that is that of external influence, and I talked about that, and rationality, as opposed to huge super political. I just talked about super PACs, yeah. Super political action committees, blah blah blah. I just sort of explained that, and I completely forgot that I had written that there, which is good because I'm on track. The idea is obviously super PACs can inform your decision and thus inform your vote by capital investment. I don't believe it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's the responsibility of the constituents to make sure that you have access to knowledge. And obviously, if I'm running for political office, or my kid's running for political office, I want them to have the most funding they can possibly get. And if my kid happens to have more funding than your kid happens to have, then my kid's going to have more exposure than your kid. And that's fine. So not to be hypocritical, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but recognize that in the public choice model, it assumes, and this might be too much of an assumption, but it assumes that the ability to decide from the individual is itself based in reason, not just exposure, right? So that's important. And if that's true or not is open for debate. We've already gone to roughly an hour mark, and I still have quite a bit to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it here, and then come back and discuss more of the public choice model, which is at the bottom of page 5. Okay, so public choice model at the bottom of page 5. Page 5 of the notes, obviously. So, number 1, based on the polycentric approach, and we know what that is, right? Based on the polycentric approach and the principle of self-government. So this idea of self-government and polycentric approach, we take the combination of both. So, and actually I probably should formalize that. The polycentric approach looks roughly like this. Sort of competition between municipalities and such, right? So it's sort of a recognition, so a polycentric approach, plus the idea of self-governance, and we talked about all of the, I guess drawing it, yeah, there's no need for me to draw this. A lot of this I recognize now. I could probably have changed and made it easier on myself and done this lecture probably sitting. I don't think there's a lot that I necessarily need to draw because it's pretty much self-explanatory, so there's really no need to draw it. But the polycentric approach, we got that. Sort of not necessarily decentralized, but a diversity in the a diversity throughout the metropolitan, in which various services are facilitated not just by one centralized government, but by any number. And we'll talk about how this looks in a second, right? So you take that polycentric approach, and I actually think I have a definition. I don't actually have the definition. Empirical means of assessing the effectiveness. Yeah. So I don't really have a definition of it, but I described it at length before. I wish I did have a definition of it. You couple it with the principles of self-government, government, and we have the public choice model. Again, a lot of this is going to be based on the assumption of the correspondence between the observation of human behavior and rationality as being the cause for that human behavior. So if there is a weakness, it'll be that. So the weakness and assumption of informing both polycentric approach and the principle of self-government influence vulnerabilities within the public choice model. So what I'm saying is conceptual weaknesses in either the polycentric model or in the idea of self-government, those conceptual weaknesses that exist in either of those will also exist in the public choice model. Okay, so let's talk about preference positions. So the assumption is economic motivation could be ethical, racial, religious, sexual preference, etc. A preference position is for the individual constituent. Given two options, and this is just an example, given two options, option A and option B, right? Given two options, option A and option B, will decide on one of the two options, will select and make their decision based on one of these two options by appealing to the four characteristics that we talked before: maximizing strategy, informational accessibility, self-interest, reason, and as such, they make the act. Their behavior becomes the act of choosing either of the position. So the question is to ask yourself, what do we mean by preference position, right? What does it mean to talk about P-O-S-I-T-I? What does it mean to talk about, a preference position? What I want to do now is I want to begin that assessment of what we're talking about. Okay, top of page 6A. So the population has a preference position based on the perceived desirability of a community whose economic expenditures are more or less set. A direct quote from page 8. So you can imagine that part of the decision, imagine that we're talking about the decision is specifically now the distinction between A and B, where A or B, this sort of wedge is or, A or, and I'll just write it actually, A or B is a metropolitan community. So A or B is a metropolitan community. And I have to decide, do I want to go to community A or do I want to go to community B? The fact that I can make that decision and thus discard another opportunity is my preference position. My preference position is where I want to go. Sort of a colloquial way of understanding it. Population has a preference position based on the perceived desirability. So that we're talking a lot about perception. So that the first thing that we need to recognize is in terms of a preference position is informed by perception. And I think this is very interesting. I think not only is it interesting theoretically, but I think it's interesting, very interesting for qualitative research. There is a lot to be said about perception. There's an enormous ability to sway the population and thus determine collective action based on perception. If people believe that a community is dangerous, they're probably not going to go to that community, irrespective of the fact. If people believe, here's a perfect example, I can't speak for people, I believe that living in Detroit, Michigan would be probably the worst decision that I could possibly make. Now, I don't know this to be a fact. I haven't been to Detroit, Michigan, but from what I hear about Detroit and the images that I've seen of Detroit, the last place in the United States of America that I would go to live is Detroit. Why? Because the way in which we, collectively, not me or you, regular people, but the media, talks about, and the pundits and the political people and blah, 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 the way in which in the media Detroit is spoken about in the United States of America isn't like the Detroit of 3 or 4 generations ago, a booming auto industry and a thriving city. It's squalid, it's bankrupt, it's destitute, it's Detroit. Thus, my preference position, the fact that I'm not going to even consider moving to Detroit, in any other state of affairs in our social life, we would call this prejudice. You would say, Jason, but you don't know this guy. Imagine that we're talking about a person. Hey, do you want to have lunch with Mary? No, I don't want to have lunch with Mary. Well, why don't you want to have lunch with Mary? I heard she's, you have to forget, I'm playing a role here. I heard she's a bitch. I heard she's naggy. I don't want to have lunch with Mary. No, I actually know Mary. I've known her for years. She's actually not that bad of a person. You should come and have lunch with her. She's interested in some of your stuff. She might be able to help you. No. I heard enough about Mary. I'm not interested in interacting with her. You see that I've now limited my possibilities, especially where she could help me, by the prejudice I have against Mary. My prejudice is unfounded and is based wholly on perception. It's amazing to think how powerful the role of perception is, because, and it probably is the case that since it's on, it's on TV nonstop, and I hear all the pundits talk about how bad Detroit is, that it is true. I haven't validated it for myself, which is why I don't speak on stuff like this publicly. The only way I would do this is if I were to go to Detroit, see it for myself, look at the assessments, have access to the stats. I haven't, so I don't speak on it. But the idea is that in terms of a preference position, you need to recognize that a lot of your beliefs, and thus the way in which you act in the world, is informed by perception. Not by fact, not by assessment, not by checking, not by research. Definitely not by research. I mean, I'm a researcher, so I do this for a living. But average John, Jane Doe don't have the time. This is why, again, I said super PACs are as powerful as they are, because super PACs help to create public perception. Not of a community, but the choice wouldn't be between do I live in region A or region B, but do I vote for, candidate A or candidate B. Thus, in terms of looking at human behavior and what we do, both individually, but more importantly, what we do collectively, perception is absolutely critical, right? and there's any number of fields that deal with public perception, the use of it, the manipulation of it, the regulation of it, blah, blah, blah. So population has a preference position based on the perceived desirability of a community whose economic expenditures are more or less. So that's pretty clear. B, the assumption is this fixed, more or less set expenditure is the means of establishing preference. What does that mean? In terms of the way in which we see advantages and disadvantages. Again, another huge, and you know, it's risk aversion is also within game theoretics. So a lot of this could be, game theory would apply perfectly, and I'm sure there has to be a huge bit. I wouldn't do it here because maybe if I do another Metropolitan video series, I might incorporate it. But just a FYI for you, just popped in my head, risk aversion comes up a lot. Though I'm not citing it a lot, it comes up a lot in here. It's sort of tacit. It's latent, sort of behind the scenes. And game theory can be used to make sense of risk aversion. Thus, you can use game theory, and people should be using game theory. I should Google it after the lecture. People should be using game theory to talk about metropolitan conflict, to talk about how we see new formations within our transforming metropolitan communities, nationally, regionally. Game theoretics would help a lot, because one of the advantages you get from game theory that you don't get from other mathematical or statistical models is that it's less affected by perception. Right? It isn't as intuitive as you might think, but our game theoretic, the application of game theory to